Hey everyone, this is part 2 of our series. If you haven't watched the previous parts in this series, please watch those first, as these videos are all built upon each other and they need to be watched in order for proper context. If you already have watched them, then let's get started with part 2 of the New Testament Unveiled. Shalom everybody, and welcome to Beit Tefillah. This part of our series is going to concentrate on testing the so-called fulfilled prophecies regarding the Messiah in the book of Matthew. They are also known as the fulfillment texts or the fulfillment citations. I believe there are 11 of these in the book of Matthew, and we're going to cover them all. I've got a lot to cover in this video, so I'm going to get right into it and move along rather quickly. Now, Matthew is a different kind of gospel of all three of the synoptic gospels. In Matthew, there are things that happen, and Matthew will tell you this occurred in order that this thing that was spoken by this certain prophet would be fulfilled. And then there's references given, and that's why they're called fulfillment texts, okay? So let's take these fulfillment texts or citations according to Matthew and just in the book of Matthew for today, and we'll investigate them. Let's read the first one in Matthew 1:22-23. And all this came to be in order to fill what was spoken by Yahuwah through the prophet, saying, See, a maiden shall conceive, and she shall give birth to a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which translated means, El is with us. This, of course, could only be referring to the following verse in Isaiah 7:14. Therefore Yahuwah gives you a sign. Look, the maiden conceives and gives birth to a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. This first text that we're going to go over is a perfect example of what I'm trying to do in this series. My prayers are that people will hear me on this verse and they will look at this verse and let it reveal to them one of the major points that I'm trying to make. This was the verse that did it for me, that kind of blew this wide open, because I was reading Isaiah one day. I probably started back in 4 and 5 and I just kind of kept reading, and when I hit Isaiah 7:14 and finished the chapter, I said, we have a problem. So I backed up at 14 again, and then I read all of chapter 7 again and said, uh-oh, we have a problem. So that's what I'm talking about here, because this was the one that started this journey for me. So let me ask, how many people have actually read this particular verse from Isaiah in context? We all just seem to rip this verse out and say, see, this is where it was prophesied by this prophet that a virgin would conceive and his name will be called Emmanuel. Then all the arguments start about what his name really is, and that the word that was used in Isaiah was Alma, which means maiden. It doesn't mean virgin, because if they would have used virgin, they would have used the Hebrew Betula. And the arguing just goes crazy, and I'm guilty of arguing too. We've all done it, I think. But if we read this verse in context, we'll see this verse has absolutely nothing to do with any type of Messiah. And since this is the only go-to verse we have where people get the born of a virgin prophecy, that's a big problem. Let's read the verse again, Isaiah 7:14. Therefore Yahuwah himself gives you a sign. Look, the maiden conceives and gives birth to a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Now, we'll read the two verses that come right after it, Isaiah 7:15-16. He eats curds and honey when he knows to refuse evil and choose the good. For before the child knows to refuse evil and choose the good, the land that you dread is to be forsaken by both her sovereigns. Wait a minute. Verse number 16 states that before this particular child being talked about in this verse is old enough to know the difference between good and evil, that the land will be forsaken by both of the kings who are over it. So this was originally spoken to Ahaz, King Ahaz, by the prophet Isaiah, that King Ahaz saw fulfilled back in his day. Start reading from the beginning of Isaiah chapter 7, verse 1 through the whole chapter and see for yourself. This was a sign to King Ahaz. And if this time frame was roughly 700 BC, and if the Messiah didn't come around until 700 years later, how could this be a sign to King Ahaz if it didn't even happen in his lifetime? Okay? One of the disturbing things about many of these texts is that the Bibles we own will lead us to believe something that isn't so. For instance, in this verse in Isaiah 7, the publishers capitalized the letter C in child to give the reader the misconception that this child was the Messiah to come. This verse has nothing to do with any type of Messiah figure, so any kind of prophecy about a child being born to a virgin has just evaporated right out the window. You'll hear some people argue and say, well, this was a double prophecy, and that's just ridiculous. And that's just a convenient way for them to grasp at straws and somehow reuse this to fit their messianic agenda. Sorry, won't work, not true. Let me just pause for a minute and mention something. As I have shown plenty of times in my videos, I read from the ISR Bible, ISR meaning Institute of Scriptural Research. Well, this Bible and many others, they put notations or footnotes at the end of verses like we're going through in Matthew, in most cases, for where they assume these fulfilled prophecies were originally foretold in the Tanakh or the Old Testament. But a question, doesn't anyone follow up on these footnotes or these notations and go back and read these verses in context for themselves? Maybe not, because I can admit that I didn't in a lot of cases. Or maybe I went back at times just to read that verse and say, yep, that's where it comes from, all right, and then went right back to what I was reading in the New Testament. Big lesson learned there. As we go through more of these fulfillment texts, we'll see why that's just more than a little embarrassing for quite a few of these when we just took the word of Matthew for it. But it's okay to admit that. I mean, we're all learning together. We should be, all of us, walking that ancient path. We should all be learning, but we're all in different spots on that path. But it's good that we admit things to one another, like, hey, we made mistakes, and now we're getting back, because we're going to find out this is a journey, okay? This is a walk, not a stand. If you're just standing on the path, you're not taking the journey. You're just standing there, and you're probably not learning. We have to keep reading. We have to keep learning. So it's okay to admit that. This is an exciting journey we're on. Sometimes it's tough when we learn things that we wanted to hold on to dearly. But we have to circumcise our heart, we have to match it to the Word, and we have to move on. That's what we're supposed to do. So as we continue on here, I'm going to touch on some of these fulfillment texts briefly with a simple explanation, but I encourage everyone to get out their Bibles and read for themselves all these verses in context. Please don't take my word for it. Don't take my word for anything. You have to read it in the scripture. You have to read it in the Tanakh and take Elohim's word or his prophets, okay? It would take me a very long time to go into every one of these fulfillment texts in great depth in one video, so I'm not going to do that. Some I'm going to go into a little bit deeper, as you'll see, and some I'm going to touch on briefly. Some of them are real simple, and they don't need much explanation at all. Okay, continuing with the next reference in Matthew 2, 5-6. And they said to him, in Bethlehem of Yehudah, for thus it has been written by the prophet, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Yehudah, you are by no means least among the rulers of Yehudah, for out of you shall come a ruler who shall shepherd my people Yisrael. This is referring to the following verse in Micah 5:2, which reads, But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, you who are among the clans of Yehudah, out of you shall come forth to me the one to become ruler in Yisrael, and his comings forth are of old from everlasting. So we have to stop and ask ourselves, is this ruler ruling now in Yisrael? No, he's not. So that would leave this one unfulfilled if it was to pertain to a Christian Messiah. First of all, Bethlehem Ephratah is a place. It's not a person. And the phrase comings forth is Strong's H4163 Mosa'ah, which means a family descent. And we're going to hear more about that in a minute. Let's just read a couple of verses later in Micah 5, 5-6. And this shall be peace. When Assyria comes into our land, and when he treads in our palaces, we shall raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 leaders of men. And they shall shepherd the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod at its entrances. And he shall deliver us from Assyria when he comes into our land, and when he treads within our borders. Now Ephrath was a clan to which the people of Bethlehem were part of. So this gives us a clear reference to King David, who descended from this clan, and his descendants, of course, and promises of a future king to protect and deliver the people from Assyria that we just read. And other prophecies tell of this ruler destroying Assyria and the other enemies of Israel until the kingdom of Elohim has come. Well, the Christian Messiah did not destroy Assyria, nor are we in the kingdom of Elohim yet, so obviously this has not been fulfilled. It's easy to see that this prophecy as well has absolutely nothing to do with the later birth of a Messiah. Let's go to the next one in Matthew 2, 14-15. And rising up, he took the child and his mother by night and departed from Mitzrayim, and remained there until the death of Herod, to fulfill what was spoken by Yahuwah through the prophet, saying, Out of Mitzrayim I have called my son. Now the Gospel of Luke has a completely different story, but that's as far as I'm going to go with that little tidbit in this video. Well, the prophet Hosea is being referred to here, and this one is such a simple thing to look up and disprove. It really is. First, let's read a short verse from the book of Exodus. This is Elohim speaking to Moses about what he is to tell Pharaoh, who is holding all of the children of Israel captive. Exodus 4:22. And you shall say to Pharaoh, thus said Yahuwah, Yisrael is my son, my firstborn. So all of Yisrael is Elohim's son and his firstborn. Check. Now we're going to read Matthew's prophecy reference from Hosea 11:1. When Yisrael was a child, I loved him, and out of Mitzrayim I called my son. This supposed prophecy text from the book of Matthew is talking about the children of Yisrael. It's plain as day. We don't even have to read outside of this single verse to get the true meaning. For the people that say, oh no, the firstborn son of Elohim is the Messiah. Okay, let's read the following verse in context with Hosea 11:1. Hosea 11:1-2. When Yisrael was a child, I loved him, and out of Mitzrayim I called my son. They called to them, so they went from their face. They slaughtered to the Baals and burned incense to carved images. So if this was about a Messiah, it appears that he also slaughtered to Baals and burned incense to carved images. Is that what they believe their Messiah did? I hope not. The problem lies when we take these verses for what we have been told they mean without even taking the time to check for ourselves. Context, context, context. We are never told by Elohim in the Tanakh that this Messiah is his firstborn or his only begotten. We're only told that in the New Testament. Okay, moving on to the next prophecy. Matthew 2:23. And came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, thus to fulfill what was spoken by the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene. Okay, this is an interesting one. Because the problem with this prophecy of he will be called a Nazarene is that it's found nowhere in the Old Testament or any extra biblical sources for that matter. Go look for it. Google it. It's not in there. Add to that fact that the city of Nazareth did not even exist back in the day of the time of the Messiah. During that time, it was a necropolis or a giant graveyard. Not a city. Whoops. So far, this isn't looking too good, is it? Okay, the next one. Matthew 3:3. For this is he who was spoken of by the prophet Yeshayahu, or Isaiah, saying, a voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of Yahuwah, make his paths straight. This is referring to the following verse in Isaiah 43. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of Yahuwah, make straight in the desert a highway for our Elohim. That verse is also similar to Malachi 3:1. See, I am sending a messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me. That's what Elohim's messengers do, the prophets do. They make the paths straight, or yashar, and upright. And sometimes prophecies can be rather vague. The only reason people think Isaiah 40 verse 3 is about John the Baptist is because they were told it was. Go and read it in context, and take note that this prophecy is about the end of the exile. In verse 1 and 2 in this chapter, Elohim is consoling his people. He says that their period of exile is over. Go read it. That's what it's about. This has nothing to do with John the Baptist. People think it is because the story of John the Baptist sounds just like it, so therefore this must be a prophecy of John. Sorry, it's not. All right, up next we have Matthew 4:13-16. And leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capharnaum, which is sometimes translated to look like Capernaum, which is by the sea in the borders of Zebulun and Naphtali, to fill what was spoken by Yeshayahu, or Isaiah the prophet, saying, land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali, the way of the sea, beyond the Yarden, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who sat in darkness saw a great light, and upon those who sat in the land in the shadow of death, light arose to them. That was referring to the following verse in Isaiah 9:1-2, which reads, but there is no gloom upon her who is distressed, as when at first he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and afterward more heavily oppressed her, by the way of the sea beyond the Yarden and Galilee of the nations. The people who were walking in darkness have seen a great light. Upon those who dwelt in the land of the shadow of death, a light has shone. Wow! Matthew was sure creative and butchered the snot out of that, didn't he? That little bit yanked out of context does somewhat give an appearance to some Messiah-like figure, but we have to jump down to verse 6 to get to the more well-known part. Isaiah 9:6. For a child shall be born unto us, a son shall be given to us, and the rule is on his shoulder. And his name is called Wonderful Counselor, Strong El, Father of Continuity, Prince of Peace. This is not talking about a Messiah. This is talking about King Hezekiah, spoken within the greater context of this. As a matter of fact, the name Hezekiah actually means strong El, or mighty is Yah. So when it's talking about strong El, that's Hezekiah's name. And remember, Elohim, or El, doesn't always mean God. Elohim told Moses that he was going to make him an Elohim to Pharaoh. Now, he didn't make Moses a god. And other kings were talked about as Elohim, because Elohim translates roughly to one with authority and power. It doesn't always just mean God, like a lot of people think it does. Let's hear a little bit about King Hezekiah from 2 Kings 18, 1-7. And it came to be in the 3rd year of Hosea, son of Elah, sovereign of Israel, that Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, sovereign of Yehudah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah, and he did what was right in the eyes of Yahuwah, according to all that his father David did. He took away the high places and broke the pillars, and cut down the Asherim, and broke in pieces the bronze serpent which Moshe had made. For until those days the children of Israel burned incense to it and called it Nehushtan. He put his trust in Yahuwah Elohi of Yisrael, and after him was none like him among all the sovereigns of Yehudah, nor who were before him, and he clung to Yahuwah. That's pretty good, right? He did not turn away from following him, but guarded his commands, which Yahuwah had commanded Moses. And Yahuwah was with him. Wherever he went, he acted wisely. King Hezekiah, best king of Judah, all time. Okay, David, king of Israel. Hezekiah, king of Judah. Another issue here, I'm not sure why the King James Bible and other versions mess with the translations as far as the verb tenses go, unless it's done a little bit to deceive and twist the scripture to fit their messianic agenda. Sometimes the Hebrew will be in the past tense, and the translation will put it into the future tense, and that's not right. Okay, a great example of what I'm talking about is the verse we were just discussing. Let's hear that again in Isaiah 9:6. For a child shall be born unto us, a son shall be given to us, and the rule is on his shoulder. The shall be born unto us and shall be given to us is not how the ancient text reads. This is how it should be translated and how it should read. Isaiah 9:6. For a child has been born to us, a son has been given to us, and the rule is on his shoulder. At the time Isaiah was writing this, the promised child had already been born. Past tense. So Matthew's fulfillment text from Isaiah 9 here, not about a future Messiah. At this point, I want to stop and interject something. Please note the fact that these New Testament passages that Christians view as fulfillment texts do actually in most cases quote the Tanakh. And that lends credence to the direction which they are trying to lure and guide the reader. The danger is that the reader is so accepting of what they are reading that they don't read for themselves to see that the context is completely different in the New Testament and the conclusions that they are being led to are completely invalid. They're not accurate at all. It's not what it says, as we are discovering, okay? Continuing with the next one. Matthew 8:16-17. And when evening had come, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out the spirits with the word and healed all who were sick, that it might be filled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, He himself took our weaknesses and bore our sicknesses. Supposedly, once again, is from Isaiah chapter 53. Truly he has borne our sicknesses and carried our pains. Good old chapter 53 of Isaiah, the chapter everybody points to as proof of the Messiah in the Old Testament. We covered this chapter in depth in the last part of the series. But we'll go over it a little more here for the sake of this so-called fulfillment text. As we learned in the last one, Isaiah 53 is not about an individual, it's about the people of Israel, spoken of as singular. We just read this verse earlier. We'll read it again. Exodus 4:22. And you shall say to Pharaoh, Thus said Yahuwah, Yisrael is my son, my firstborn. Spoken as singular. Doesn't say my sons or my people. Spoken of as singular for a group. Here was the entire nation of Yisrael that is spoken about by Elohim as one. That's how it sounds. That's how it reads. Yahuwah told Moses to tell Pharaoh that Yisrael, being the multitudes of Jacob's descendants who were in bondage in Egypt under Pharaoh, were his firstborn. The whole big family of Israel. The same in Hosea 11:1. When Yisrael was a child, I loved him, and out of Mitzrayim I called my son. Let's read this verse. Isaiah 53:10. He would see a seed, he would prolong his days, and the pleasure of Yahuwah would prosper in his hand. Did the Christian Messiah see a seed? Did he have kids? No. Were his days prolonged? Hardly, if he was killed in his early 30s, supposedly. And did he prosper? Well, I have him saying the Son of Man has no place to lay his head, and when he needed money, he didn't have it. He took it out of the mouth of a fish. I don't think he prospered. If this was evidence for a Christian Messiah in the court of law, Isaiah 53 would let him off the hook for not fitting the bill. Isaiah 53, not about a Messiah. Up next we have Matthew 12, 15 to 20. But Yahusha, knowing it, withdrew from there, and large crowds followed him, and he healed them all, and warned them not to make him known, in order that was spoken by Isaiah the prophet might be filled, saying, See, my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved in whom my being did delight, I shall put my spirit upon him, and he shall declare right ruling to the nations. He shall not strive, nor cry out, nor shall anyone hear his voice in the streets. A crushed reed he shall not break, and smoking flax he shall not quench, till he brings forth right ruling forever. This is referring to the following verse in Isaiah 42, 1 through 3, which reads, See my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one, my being has delighted in. I have put my spirit upon him, he brings forth right ruling to the nations. He does not cry out, nor lifts up his voice, nor causes his voice to be heard in the street. A crushed reed he does not break, and smoking flax he does not quench. He brings forth right ruling in accordance with truth. This is about the people of Israel being led by Elohim, not about a Messiah. Here's another great one to go read in context. If people would just read a few verses further, they'd run into this, which causes a bit of a snag to the fulfillment text. Isaiah 42, 8. I am Yahuwah, that is my name, and my esteem I do not give to another, nor my praise to idols. We would also do well to remember this in the very next chapter, Isaiah 43, 10 to 14. You are my witnesses, declares Yahuwah, and my servant whom I have chosen, so that you know and believe me and understand that I am he. Before me there was no El formed, nor after me there is none. I am Yahuwah, and besides me there is no Savior. I have declared and saved and made known, and there was no foreign mighty one among you. You are my witnesses, declares Yahuwah, that I am El. Even from the day I am he, and no one delivers out of my hand. I work, and who turns it back? Thus said Yahuwah, your Redeemer, the set-apart one of Yisrael. That right there should put an end to the Messiah myth, but it won't. People still cling to it. You know, people may claim to have left churchianity, but they still ended up dragging out their Messiah idol with them. They just slapped a new name on him and kept a lot of the same pagan characteristics, like him being half God, half man, which is a demigod that is straight out of the whole Greek-Roman mythology type of belief thing. Remember the story of Jacob and Rachel, when Jacob fled Laban's house with his wives and their children? And even though Rachel may have left with the one who would soon be renamed Israel, she still carried out the idols of her father from her father's house. And she died because of it. Think about that. People are doing the same thing today after they have left their father's house where they grew up practicing Christianity. They drag the Messiah idol right out along with them. The next fulfillment text is in Matthew 26:31. Then Yahusha said to them, All of you shall stumble in me this night, for it has been written, I shall strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered. This is referring to the following verse in Zechariah 13:7. O sword, awake against my shepherd, against the man who is my companion, declares Yahuwah of hosts. Smite the shepherd, and let the sheep be scattered, but I shall turn my hand upon the little ones. Okay, this one takes a bit of explaining. Pulled out of context, it might seem that this verse has something to do with the Messiah, and especially when the previous verse is read with it. So in all honesty, let's read that verse now. Zechariah 13:6. And one shall say to him, What are these wounds in your hands? And he shall say, Because I was wounded at home by those who love me. Now, there's a little mistranslation here by the King James and other translators of the Bible. They falsely translate Strong's H996, which is the Hebrew bain, which actually means between, having changed it to the word in. This creates a significant change in the question, which is, what are these wounds between your hands? To which now reads, what are these wounds in your hands? So this gives the reader the impression of the wounds in the hands of the Messiah. Something that people would never think of unless they were reading this text with that thought in mind. This is why we have to dig into these fulfillment texts and prove them out. However, there is also some misunderstanding here and not just merely a minor mistranslation. As we read a couple verses earlier, a completely different image emerges about this wounded person. Zechariah 13:4-5. And it shall be in that day that the prophet shall be ashamed, every one of his vision when he prophesies, and not put on a hairy robe on in order to deceive, but shall say, I am no prophet, I am a farmer, for a man sold me as a slave in my youth. The prophet, with the wounds referred to in Zechariah 13:6, turns out to be a false prophet. Even though he wore the hairy mantle, which was a set-apart robe that was worn by the prophets of Israel during that time. Let's read Zechariah 13:7 again. O sword, awake against my shepherd, against the man who is my companion, declares Yahuwah of hosts. Smite the shepherd, and let the sheep be scattered, but I shall turn my hand upon the little ones. This shepherd is described 2 chapters earlier as being both foolish and worthless. Zechariah 11:15-17. And Yahuwah said to me, Take again the implements of a foolish shepherd, for look, I am raising up a shepherd in the land who does not visit those straying, nor seek the young, nor heal those that are broken, nor feed those that still stand. But he does eat the flesh of the fat and tear off their hooves. Woe to the worthless shepherd forsaking the flock. Let a sword be upon his arm and upon his right eye. His arm shall wither, and his right eye shall be dimmed. Now, I doubt very much that the Christians would give their Messiah the characteristics of a shepherd that is foolish, worthless, and a false prophet. Unfortunately, the creative writer that constructed the false book of Matthew didn't know the Tanakh well enough when he handpicked these fulfillment texts. This is why reading in context is so important. Go back and read Zechariah chapters 11, 12, and 13 for yourself. Next up, we have Matthew 27, 3-10. Then Yehuda, who delivered him up, having seen that he had been condemned, repented, and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and to the elders, saying, I have sinned in delivering up innocent blood. And they said, What is that to us? You see to it. And throwing down the pieces of silver in the dwelling place, he left and went and hung himself. And the chief priest took the silver pieces and said, It is not right to put them into the treasury, seeing they are by the price of blood. So they took counsel and bought with them the potter's field for the burial of strangers. Therefore that field has been called the field of blood until today. Then was filled what was spoken by Yirmiyahu the prophet, saying, And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him who was pierced, of whom the children of Israel set at a price, and gave them for the potter's field as Yahuwah had ordered me. Okay, there's a problem with this one. This is actually what Zechariah wrote, not Jeremiah. Now take note of the difference in these two situations. The one that we just read in Matthew was very negative and depressing, and the one in Zechariah is pretty positive. And it's not in this kind of context at all. Zechariah 11, 12-13. And I said to them, If it is good in your eyes, give me my wages, and if not, refrain. So they weighed out for my wages 30 pieces of silver. And Yahuwah said to me, Throw it to the potter, the splendid price at which I was valued by them. And I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of Yahuwah for the potter. Nothing sad or depressing about that. That has no bearing on what we just read in the so-called fulfillment text of Matthew. Jeremiah, however, in 32, 7-9, talks about buying a field. That's it, and it's for 17 shekels of silver. And the money wasn't thrown or given to a potter. So that's not it. Some other versions have a different word for potter, which makes a little more sense. I don't know how accurate it is, but let's read it for treasury instead of potter and see how that sounds. Zechariah 11:13. And Yahuwah said to me, Cast it into the treasury, the goodly price that I was prized at of them. And I took the 30 pieces of silver and cast them into the treasury in the house of Yahuwah. That makes more sense than a potter sitting in the house of Yahuwah. The treasury's in there. This is another fulfillment text that we need to read in context and realize that it has nothing to do with any kind of prophecy about Judas throwing away his 30 pieces of silver that he betrayed a Messiah for. Nothing. It's only because of the New Testament story that makes people think it does. The last fulfillment text is Matthew 27:35. And having impaled him, they divided his garments, casting lots, that it might be filled what was spoken by the prophet, that they divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. This is based on Psalm 22, verse 18. They divide my garments among them, and for my raiment they cast lots. Psalm 22. It is very important that this entire chapter be read in context, because although the book of Matthew claims it to be a prophecy, it is not. The writer of the book of Matthew and other gospel accounts use quite a bit from Psalm chapter 22 to insert into their Messiah narrative. Psalm 22 is all about King David lamenting to Elohim. He is the one crying out, feeling forsaken. That's what this whole chapter is about. It has nothing to do with any Messiah until they invented a Messiah and based quite a bit of his suffering on this chapter of Psalms, which was simply David crying out to Elohim in a very descriptive manner. Go read it yourself. This is going to be a hard one for people to accept, however, as they think they can see what happened to the Messiah in what David wrote in this chapter, only because of what they've been taught and how the New Testament has been constructed to look like this. Now, as we have gone through this list from the alleged Gospel of Matthew, it's quite easy to see that this Gospel account is a complete fabrication and the twisting of truth to create this fictitious Messiah and give him some kind of pseudo-credibility by basing parts of his life on the prophets in the Tanakh. Most people are going to vehemently disagree with me because they have grown up with the New Testament, and when they read the Old Testament, they can see these traces of the New Testament in it. That's due to creative writing and fabrications by wicked people who are trying to lead us into idolatry. If people were not raised believing in this Messiah or reading anything called the New Testament, they would have never credited any of these prophetic fulfillment texts to a future Messiah. It just wouldn't have happened. I urge you to take your own Bible and read all of these for yourself. Check out what I just presented. Like I said, don't take my word for it. I'll see you in the next part for some more unveiling, where we examine whether or not human sacrifice is accepted by Elohim to atone for sin. So, join me for part 3, up next. Shalom.